Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Pan Future Podcast. Today is Saturday, February 10th, 2018. This week, I have an interview with Dr. Emily Monosson, mostly about her most recent book called Natural Defense, Enlisting Bugs and Germs to Protect Our Food and Health. Stories about how science and nature are working together now. And also, we had some good conversations about the nature of academia and how things are changing for women who are working in academic and scientific fields, and especially for those who decide to be mothers as well. Before we get to that interview, let's do some news. First item in the news this week: if you are in Tokyo, be sure to stop by the Henna Cafe in Tokyo's downtown and order a coffee from a robot. Yes, there is a one-armed robot that scans a ticket that you purchase at a vending machine, and it greets the customer. It says, "Would you care for a delicious coffee?" The barista, with a screen showing a pair of cartoon eyes, asks in a flat tone, "I can make one better than human beings around here." So the cafe has a robot that will make your coffee for you. It can also make cappuccino, hot chocolate, green tea latte, and several other things. So that's cool. And keep your eyes open to see if this kind of thing will show up more and more, perhaps in your neighborhood Starbucks. And now,
it came from outer space.
In the space news this week, obviously, the big news, SpaceX, Elon Musk launching their Falcon Heavy rocket, beautifully landing the two booster rockets and sadly not quite landing the core rocket, but also putting a payload in space consisting of a Tesla Roadster, which will orbit out toward the asteroid belt and back for perhaps 1 billion years. Who knows? Now, of course, you've all seen about that, and I don't need to talk about it, because it was the gorilla in the room this week for space news. There's some other stuff going on here. Researchers scanned 14 worlds from the Kepler mission for technosignatures. This group, primarily led by people from UCLA, were looking for particular radio frequencies from the data from the Kepler catalog. They looked at 14 systems. They looked at a specific frequency range, sort of Arecibo class transmitter, as they put it. They found 850,000 candidate signals, and after whittling out the noise caused by Earth and its own radio signals and interference and GPS satellites and other things, they were left with 19 candidates for further study. At this point, they cannot be certain that these are from extraterrestrials, nor can they be certain that they are from a natural source. They're sort of unexplained at the moment. I expect research to continue on this. I bring up this story mostly because I am kind of amazed and fascinated that our technology is at the point where we can actually do this. You know, beyond just finding planets around another system, and beyond looking for biomarkers like the oxygen content of an atmosphere to see if maybe it's Earth-like or is it in the right distance from its sun. We're actually looking for signs of technology from specific planetary systems. So that is fascinating, and that is your news of the moment. All right, on this week's show, I have a special guest, Dr. Emily Monosson. She is an independent scientist, a writer, and she specializes in toxicology, which is a subject she also sometimes teaches. Dr. Monosson, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sean.
So we first connected on a forum some time ago about the time you were writing a book. So why don't we just dive right in with what that book was all about?
Okay. Well, the title of it was called Natural Defense, Enlisting Bugs and Germs to Protect Our Food and Health. And so the goal of that book was really to explore how we could control pests and pathogens while relying less on some of our regular chemical controls that we have in the past.
Okay. Is this like a brand new field of research? Is this something that's been kind of slowly bubbling in the background for a while?
So I think it depends on what you mean by field. So this book was sort of a collection of a lot of different fields, and it kind of ranged from microbes in the soil to artificial intelligence in phones on the farm. So it was sort of a big collection of stuff. And some of them were high-tech advances, and some are really kind of basic things that people have known for, decades, like how to, in farming, the importance of healthy soils that they've known for so long, but we've kind of lost track of.
Yeah. Well, how about give us an example of one of those, like you talk about the healthy soil. That's something that farmers have known for a long time, but as a sort of the industrial scale that we need to feed everyone on the planet, are we sort of wrapping back around to listening to the farmers, and what's the new development in that area?
So I'm not sure it's necessarily a new development, but I think as we all know, like the organic market has grown. That's in part because of consumer pressures, but some of the organic practices, which include building up healthy soils, is something that that was farmers would have been doing that way before our industrial agriculture, and then when we started putting fertilizer, doing lots of tilling, we kind of lost sight of that, or farmers did, in using pesticides. And so now, as some of these pesticides are becoming less effective because we've been using them for so long, and insects and weeds are getting really good at resisting them, growers are looking for new ways to sort of manage pests and pathogens. And the ironic thing is, and sometimes it means going back to older ways where you're actually looking to nature and work with nature instead of always against nature. So I think that's the newer thing, is that whether it's by sort of consumer pressure or just even need for some kind of pest or pathogen control that actually is working, we're looking to sort of work in a way where, whether it's building up healthier soils, and if you have a really healthy soil, it's called the microbiome, just like you hear about the human microbiome. Soil's got a really complex microbiome. Right. All the microbes from bacteria and viruses and fungi that are in the soil. When that's a really healthy community, it can help fend off disease and can help provide better nutrients for growing plants. Sort of just like our microbiome. When we have now we're learning that when we maintain a healthy microbiome, we can help fend off diseases and benefit better from the things that we eat, just because we're our gut's healthy or whatever.
Right.
It's a similar idea. That was actually one point of the book, which was different, was to bring together thinking about agriculture and human health, and how we approach those two things. Those fields have typically been very separate. You've got people working in agriculture, you've got people working in human health, but both of them are trying to control pathogens. And sometimes we're trying to control pests. But the fields have been so separate, and some of the approaches, those that people are beginning to think about, are similar. So one of the goals of the book was to bring those two things together and get people to think about sort of, it's all one system. And a lot of the solutions are the same, whether you're talking about farm, field, or human.
What is the state of scientific research in this? Is it, for myself, I try to be very science-minded, and I'm a skeptic about a lot of things that lack good evidence behind them. So whenever I talk to someone about sort of this kind of thing or some new medical research or something like that. And when you're pushing into areas where people haven't spent a lot of time doing research yet, I feel like you're sort of walking a line between being, yes, this really does work, or we just wish this works because we want to be happy hippies or something.
I think that's a great question. I think one of the problems with just as sort of as you put it, we tend to be black and white. You know, it's either you're using pesticides or you're all organic. You're for GMOs or you're totally against them.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of science out there, and a lot of it's in the gray area, as you mentioned. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. But I think part of the problem is we have this sort of, we divide things into good or bad. And they don't necessarily fall that way, and that's just not the way life works. So I think when you're asking, are we wishing that we could do some of the stuff, there's a lot of evidence out there that say healthy soil microbiome, which is increasingly growing, the amount of sort of people referring to it as being important. I think that science has been out there for a long time. We've just lost track of it because we've been so focused on using chemicals in agriculture. And it's hard. That, you know, the flip side is it's probably hard for any grower to change. And I listened to one webinar where one solution for growers is to intercrop and put different kinds of crops instead of just total monoculture. And they were talking about some very conventional farmers that were starting to, you know, put different crops in with their wheat fields or in between or whatever. And it was working for them, so they could, you know, they were sort of having less problems with weeds or pests or whatever. But what it would take for anybody else to change is to see that the farmer next to them was doing it and that it was working. You know, because nobody wants to take a chance because it's your livelihood and you don't want to change over to something.
Yeah.
So when you're asking about the science, you can have as much science, but it really takes actually showing that something can work or be beneficial, and it's not going to be all the time. Nothing's 100%. Not even, you know.
Yeah, I'm sure this approach probably, it might not work for everyone. It depends on what kind of farming you're doing or what kind of work you're doing, too.
Yeah, and actually a really interesting human example of something that's old but new and now getting a lot of attention in terms of research is the bacteriophage therapy. So treating people with viruses cure bacterial diseases. And these are viruses that attack very specific bacteria. And that was something that was used over 100 years ago. We lost track of it here in the U.S. and stopped using it. And now when we've got antibiotic resistance, people are starting to tout this kind of bacteriophage therapy. And that is one of those things where it's on the, you know, people are like, well, is it effective? We haven't, you know, where's all the science? A lot of science was done in Eastern Europe, so people here don't necessarily, you know, they think that it's really not the gold standard kind of science. So now they're rushing to do a lot of studies on this because it's potentially a very powerful remedy for certain incurable diseases. And it's been used as a sort of a last line of defense in some cases here in the U.S. It's really fascinating that people with sometimes, you know, antibiotic resistant MRSA or, you know, staph infections or other kinds of infections have been cured with using this new therapy, which is this old therapy, but used in a new way. So actually the science has enabled people to really refine it and use it in a way that maybe it wasn't used 100 years ago or currently used in other places. Anyway, so I guess it's a give and take of ongoing science.
Well, and like so many things, there's gray areas and there's nuance, and we really, I think, in all aspects of our society, need to get away from the all or nothing kind of attitude that we tend to have. When you're back to the bacteriophage idea, when you use a virus in that manner, is there any risk of the virus itself mutating and becoming something that you don't intend it to be, or spreading in a way that you don't intend? Or are they handled differently?
So these are viruses that are very specific for bacteria. So first of all, they will attack a bacteria. So they're not something that would, it's not like a flu virus that will attack our cells. So I think there's always, no matter what you do with anything, there's always an unknown. There's always a potential risk, but you weigh the risk benefit. And right now that these therapies, nobody's really seen that kind of problem. They have been shown to be really useful and beneficial. And I think the more that with technological advances and being able to look at genomics and understanding the genetics better, I think there's probably better controls and sort of more targeted therapies where they can minimize risk.
Yeah. Back to the sort of the farming question, the soil health question, are people actually introducing bacteria or anything into the environment? Or are they just, is it more turning to the way the soil should be?
Compost is one way.
Okay.
In nutrients, I guess that. But yes, I spoke to a couple of scientists who are developing sort of a kind of like a probiotic for the soil. There's lots of people trying to develop bacteria that you can add into the soil that are known sort of to be in the soil anyway, but they're enriching it and enabling farmers to apply that and they're bacteria that might get to the roots and help roots, take up nutrients better. So that's one way of sort of having bacteria to help kind of fertilize or, allow a plant to grow better. And also a really big area is using different kinds of bacteria that can attack fungi, that can protect against other bacteria or fungi or whatever. So there's a lot of products like that are out there. I mean, I've used them. There's a lot of products like, I can't remember the name of it, but I've used it on my own grapes. You can spray a bacterium. It's a spore-forming bacterium. You spray it onto your grapes, and that can combat, protect against, say, a fungus that might be impacting the grapes.
Okay.
So that's been around for a while, but that kind of biopesticide is really a growing area, even for conventional growers, I think.
Interesting. And you mentioned when we got started here, artificial intelligence. In what way is that impacting this sort of return to nature approach?
So one of the best things that we could do, right, is to prevent disease or to get it right when it starts instead of, or pests or, any kind of problem. If you can get it before it starts, you're better off. So I spoke to some scientists that are developing a phone app that can help farmers take a photo of whatever, damage they have to a leaf. And through machine learning, by, training this app on, hundreds of thousands of images, it would be able to identify the disease. And their goal is so that farmers anywhere in the world could use this. So here, a lot of farmers are able to go to their local ag co-op, university, the cooperative extension, and say, what's the problem? But if they're somewhere in, some far-flung place in another country, and they're not able to do that, they can use their phone to diagnose disease. And then be able to respond to it much more quickly.
Yeah, fascinating. There's another topic I was intending to ask you about as well. If you're comfortable talking about it, I'll do some editing with this, so there's dead air or whatever. We'll just let the whole thing run. I wanted to ask you about your experiences as a woman in scientific fields, and also if you wanted to talk about one of your other books. I know it's a topic that you have considered also at length, and if you had any thoughts on the more recent events in our country and in academia.
I have to say that I never really considered, so I went through school in the 80s, graduate school is when I got my start in the sciences, and it never occurred to me that I was a woman in science. It just never, and maybe I had a great experience, maybe I had good advisors. They were all male. I have to say, beyond college, I did not have any women that I actually worked with as through the learning process in graduate school. But I never really had any problems, although there were. Back then, though, I can think of plenty of men who would have been called up on harassment charges where we just said, people just ignored them. Things that they would say and do to women scientists because we're women, and that was probably happening anywhere. Propositions, just improper behavior that, but that was just, I hate to say it, but that was probably the 80s and 90s. You just said, that guy's a jerk.
Yeah.
You didn't do anything about it because we didn't really, who would you tell? And at what level, where was the threshold of being able to say something? So I think that's something that's changed.
Yeah.
You don't have to put up with that anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe. But otherwise, throughout my career, I don't think I ever had any problem that way. The only thing that's different, of course, is that if you are someone who's going to become a parent and you're going to get pregnant, it's, you're the woman, you're the one that's doing that. And so that's where my career path diverged. Because I knew once that I wanted a family, did my partner. And so I also decided that I wanted to be home for the kids. And that was a career-changing thing because I knew that I wanted to work part-time. Yeah. And that's very difficult to do probably in a lot of careers, and in science in particular, where the main route is through academia or sort of a conventional institution. Back in the 80s and 90s, part-time was not an option. And you weren't considered serious if you were wanting to work part-time. And so that sort of set me off on this course of doing sort of an independent, alternative kind of career path or non-traditional career path.
Yeah.
And then because of that, I became interested in other women's experiences and how did they deal with this, all the women that went through science but didn't end up in academic institutions. Because that's a really rich area to explore, because I think people who are outside of academia have a lot to contribute and they're often marginalized.
Yeah. And so you one of your books is about that topic, right? The
yes.
Motherhood, the Elephant in the Laboratory?
Yes, that's correct. So, that was a book that I put together maybe 8 or 10 years ago. But yes, it was, I wanted to explore women who were mostly outside of academia and some who were within academia, because that's the traditional path for scientists, and to understand, how having kids impacted their life as a scientist. And so I had, it's a collection of 34 essays of women scientists. They were an interesting group because they came from all different decades of getting their PhDs. So some were in the 70s and they had, and some were in the 2000s. And what was really striking was that some of their experiences really weren't that different. So I had one woman who wrote about being fired from her job as a postdoc, which is sort of the first job you often get after getting your PhD. It's a temporary position. But she was essentially fired because she got pregnant. And so that was hard for me to even believe that would happen in 2000. And the interesting thing was this was all done through email. I didn't know any of these women. And so they were submitting these essays. And when I got hers, I had to look her up to make sure that this was really, someone that I could trust, because I couldn't believe that. And it was true.
Yeah.
She subsequently worked with the human resources of that organization, and they've changed their policy.
Oh, good.
So, but people did all sorts of things, and I think it was interesting to hear what they did, and helpful for other people to know that there are other routes through science.
Do you think that academia has kind of not self-examined the way it should until maybe very recently?
Yeah, I feel that. I think that's true. I think there are changes being made now, as you say, very recently. But for a long time, and even just 10 or so years ago, I think grad students were still getting the message from their advisors that, the best route through science is to go into academia, and if you don't, then there's always been this sort of stigma that if you don't end up in academia, it's because you couldn't.
Yeah.
And so now I think there's a much knowing that first of all, there aren't that many jobs out there in academia, but there's a lot of jobs in other places. There's a big emphasis in some of the major scientific organizations to educate new students on all the different possibilities and things you can do with your PhDs, like getting into politics.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we need more of that.
Yeah. So, or education,
right.
That's, educating the public. I think so these days, especially just in the last few years, the last year, it's become really clear that there's a lot of roles for scientists, and we need to get outside of academia to educate and sort of, and not even necessarily even educate, communicate with both ways with the public and policymakers.
Everywhere I look, it's that gray area is the important area, and the public discussion, if you spend any time on Twitter, even 5 minutes, it's all, everybody is so completely black and white. It's a mess. Sometimes it's disheartening to see how nuance has completely been lost in everything.
Oh, it's true. But, you can't blame the public for that necessarily either, because a lot of it's even the science communication, and it's the PR that comes out of, so part of it is the media. You want to get it out. Well, you're not going to say this may cause a problem. That's not going anywhere.
Right. Yeah.
So anyway, I think that's important to get out there. So I think it's great that you're talking to people and scientists and getting that kind of, having that kind of conversation with them.
Yeah. Oh, there's one more question I should ask you before you go. I try to remember to ask this of all my guests. Somewhere far off in the future, when humans have left the planet and there's no more humans on Earth anymore, who would be your pick for the next species to evolve into a civilization on Earth?
Oh, gosh.
This is your science fiction question, the Planet of the Apes question.
Has to be a civilization, because everybody knows microbes are going to inherit the Earth. But
I would say it doesn't have to be technologically advanced, but at least some group that would make art and How
about bonobos?
Okay. That would be a good choice, and I think they would be a great choice too, because they're known for being a rather peaceful species.
Yeah, I know.
So. Yeah, that's a great one. All right. I don't have any other particular questions. If someone was interested in reading your books or finding more about what you do you have a website or something we can send people to?
I do occasionally blog at a website called Toxic Evolution, .wordpress.com.
Okay.
And Island Press is the publisher for the toxicology books, and Cornell Press is the publisher for the Motherhood book, but they are all available on Amazon.
Okay, I'll be sure to put links for these in the show notes so people can check that out. Well, Dr. Emily Monosson, thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you, Sean. That was fun.
All right, take care.
Bye.
All right, thank you, as always, for joining me this week on the show, and special thank you to Dr. Emily Monosson for being on the show. Be sure to go to the website panfuture.org, look at the show notes so you can find links to Dr. Monosson's blog, and I'll put a link to the Amazon page for her books. Be sure to check those out, as well as links to the other news stories that I covered today. And that's all I got for you this week. So, as always, I will talk to you again in the future. Mm-hmm.